When Bridget, when Bridget O'Connor stepped off the dusty train in Iron Ridge, Montana, she thought she'd finally escaped the nightmare of her past. Fleeing an abusive marriage in Ireland with forged death papers, she'd come west as a mail-order bride, hoping to disappear forever. But Magnus Thornfield, the gentle giant who'd agreed to marry her, was nothing like she'd expected, and neither was the love that would bloom between two souls the world had rejected. At 6'9" and built like a mountain, Magnus had been called a monster his entire life. Bertie, with her fuller figure and secret scars, had been told she was worthless. But when a violent past catches up and danger threatens their newfound happiness, these two outcasts will discover that sometimes the biggest hearts come in the most unexpected packages. This is a story of healing acceptance and the courage to love when the world tells you you're not worthy. Like and subscribe for more heartwarming Western romance stories that prove love sees what others cannot. You're Too Big. When Gentle Giant met his mail-order bride, neither expected this kind of love. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on Iron Ridge, Montana territory as the afternoon train wheezed to a stop at the small wooden platform. Bridget O'Connor pressed her face against the window, watching the collection of weathered buildings that would either become her sanctuary or her prison. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her best dress, a faded green wool that had seen better days but was all she could afford after paying for passage west. Beneath the fabric, old bruises had finally faded, but the memories they represented would never completely heal. "He can't find me here," she told herself for the 100th time since leaving Boston. "He thinks I'm dead. The forged papers will hold." "Iron Ridge," the conductor called. "End of the line." Bertie gathered her courage along with her small carpet bag and stepped down onto the platform. The town was smaller than she'd imagined, just a main street with a few shops, a church, and what looked like a saloon. But it was far enough from Ireland and the nightmare she'd left behind. She looked around for Magnus Thornfield, the man who'd answered her letter requesting a husband. His correspondence had been brief but kind, mentioning only that he was a rancher in need of a wife to help manage his property. He'd warned her that he was larger than most men, but hadn't elaborated. A small crowd had gathered to see the new arrival, their faces curious but not unkind. Bertie scanned the group looking for someone who might be her intended. "Miss O'Connor." The voice came from behind her, deep and hesitant. Bertie turned and found herself looking up, far up at the largest man she'd ever seen. Magnus Thornfield stood nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders that seemed to span the width of the platform. His brown hair was neatly combed and his clothes were clean but worn. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, gentle gray-blue eyes that held a lifetime of pain and loneliness. "Mr. Thornfield," she managed, her Irish accent thickening with nervousness. Magnus nodded, and Bertie saw the exact moment his gaze took in her appearance. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not with disgust, but with what looked like disappointment, quickly followed by resignation. She was used to that look. In Ireland, her husband Sean had worn it constantly after their wedding day, when he realized the pretty young bride he thought he was getting was actually a woman with curves that defied the current fashion for tiny waists. "Welcome to Iron Ridge," Magnus said quietly. His voice was careful, controlled. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." "Not too bad, thank you." Bertie lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "Though I suspect it may have been easier than what's to come." Behind them, she could hear the whispered comments from the townspeople. "Lord Almighty, would you look at the size of him next to her? Poor thing probably didn't know what she was getting into. Match made in heaven, I'd say. Neither of them's likely to do better." The last comment, delivered with cruel laughter, made Bertie's cheeks burn. But she noticed Magnus's jaw tighten, and when he stepped slightly in front of her, blocking her from the crowd's stares, she felt an unexpected surge of gratitude. "My wagon's just over here," he said gently. They walked in silence to where a sturdy wagon waited, hitched to 2 massive draft horses that seemed more in proportion to their owner. Magnus helped her up onto the seat, and Bertie tried not to notice how carefully he controlled his strength, how gentle his huge hands were despite their power. The ride to his ranch took them through country that was both beautiful and harsh. Rolling hills covered with prairie grass, distant mountains purple against the sky, and a vastness that made Bertie feel both free and terrifyingly small. "It's beautiful," she said softly, meaning it. It's hard country, Magnus replied, echoing the landscape around them. Harder than what you're probably used to in Ireland, Bertie almost laughed. If he only knew what she was used to, the constant fear, the walking on eggshells, the nights spent hiding bruises and making excuses for her husband's temper. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Thornfield, she said. Magnus glanced at her, and this time his assessment seemed different, more thoughtful. I suspect you are Miss O'Connor. The ranch when it came into view was modest, but well maintained. The house was built from local stone and timber, sturdy enough to withstand Montana winters. The barn and outbuildings showed signs of careful attention, and the pastures held cattle that looked healthy and well-fed. It's not much, Magnus said, and Bertie could hear the apology in his voice. It's honest work and a roof over my head, she replied. That's more than many have. Magnus helped her down from the wagon, and Bertie noticed how he was careful not to let his hands linger, how he stepped back immediately to give her space. It was so different from Sean's possessive grabbing that it took her a moment to process. Inside the house was clean but sparse. The furniture was all oversized, built to accommodate Magnus's frame, but it was well crafted and comfortable. What struck Bertie most was the loneliness that seemed to permeate every room. This was the home of a man who'd learned to live entirely alone. You'll have the room upstairs, Magnus said, gesturing toward a staircase that looked sturdy enough to support his weight. I sleep in the back room down here. Bertie nodded, relieved by the separation. She needed time to adjust, to figure out how to navigate this new life without revealing too much about the old one. I'll get supper started, she offered. You don't need to, Mr. Thornfield, Bertie interrupted gently. I came here to be your wife and partner. That means pulling my weight. Magnus looked surprised by her directness. All right then, I'll tend to the horses and give you time to settle in. In the kitchen, Bertie found ingredients that spoke of a man doing his best to feed himself without much knowledge or enthusiasm for cooking. She set to work with practiced efficiency, her hands moving automatically while her mind processed her new situation. Magnus Thornfield was nothing like what she'd expected. He was enormous, yes, but there was a gentleness to him that was completely foreign to her experience with men. When he'd helped her from the wagon, his touch had been careful, respectful. When the townspeople had made their cruel comments, he'd moved to protect her without being asked. Most surprising of all, he seemed as disappointed in their arrangement as she was, but for entirely different reasons than she'd anticipated. She'd expected rejection because of her size, her plainness, her lack of dowry. Instead, she'd seen something that looked almost like understanding in his eyes, as if he too knew what it felt like to be judged and found wanting. Dinner was a quiet affair. Bertie had prepared a simple stew with vegetables from Magnus's garden, along with fresh bread she'd managed to coax from his stores. She watched him eat with the careful manners of someone who'd learned to be conscious of his eat, how he held his utensils delicately despite his massive hands. This is very good, he said after his first tentative bite. Thank you, I enjoy cooking. Where did you learn your family? Bertie's fork paused halfway to her mouth, from Mrs. Riley next door, who taught me after Sean broke my wrist and I couldn't work for a month. My mother mostly, she said instead. She died when I was 16. I'm sorry for your loss. The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. What about your family, Mr. Thornfield? Are they nearby? Magnus's expression closed off. No family, haven't had any for a long time. The pain in those few words told Bertie volumes. Whatever had happened to drive Magnus to this isolated life, it had been profound and lasting. They finished the meal in comfortable silence, and Bertie began clearing the dishes. As she worked, she became aware of Magnus watching her movements with something that wasn't quite suspicion, but wasn't trust either. Miss O'Connor, he said finally, might I ask you something? Bertie's hands stilled on the plates she was washing. Of course. When you wrote to me about becoming a mail-order bride, you mentioned that you were looking for a fresh start. What were you starting fresh from? The question was gently asked, but Bertie heard the underlying wariness. Magnus Thornfield might be lonely, but he wasn't naive. Ireland has been hard these past years, she said carefully. The potato blight, the poverty. Many of us came to America looking for something better. That's the general reason, Magnus said. I'm asking about the specific one. Bertie turned to face him, studying his expression. She could see the intelligence behind his gentle eyes, the way he'd learned to read people who might mean him harm. He deserved honesty, or at least as much honesty as she could safely give. I was married before, she said quietly. Magnus's expression didn't change, but she saw his hands tighten slightly on his coffee cup. He died, Bertie continued. Mining accident. Left me with nothing but his debts and no family to help. It wasn't entirely a lie. Sean probably was dead by now. The forged papers she'd paid dearly for said he'd died in a cave-in at the copper mines. And she had been left with nothing but debts, though they were from Sean's gambling rather than any honest work. I'm sorry, Magnus said simply. It wasn't a good marriage, Bertie admitted. His death was a relief more than a tragedy. Magnus nodded slowly, and Bertie had the uncomfortable feeling he could see more than she wanted to reveal. We all carry things we'd rather not discuss, he said finally. I suppose what matters is whether we're running towards something or just running away. Which are you doing, Mr. Thornfield? The question seemed to surprise him. For a moment his careful guard slipped, and Bertie saw a flash of deep old pain. I stopped running years ago, he said. Found a place where I could be left alone, where my differences wouldn't frighten anyone. Is that why you wanted a mail-order bride? Someone who wouldn't know what to expect? Magnus's laugh was bitter. I wanted a partner, someone who might see past appearances to something worthwhile underneath. And what did you find instead? The question hung between them, sharp and honest. Magnus looked at her for a long moment, and Bertie saw him wrestling with whether to speak the truth or offer polite lies. I found someone else who knows what it's like to be judged by appearances, he said finally. The admission hit Bertie like a physical blow. Not because it was cruel, but because it was kind. Magnus wasn't rejecting her, he was recognizing her. That's not what you wanted, though, she said. No, he admitted. I wanted someone who would look at me and see a man instead of a monster. I suppose you wanted someone who would look at you and see a woman instead of... He trailed off, but Bertie could finish the sentence. Instead of damaged goods. Instead of secondhand goods. Instead of a woman who took up too much space in a world that preferred its females delicate and decorative. Instead of a burden, she said quietly. Magnus's expression softened. You're not a burden, Miss O'Connor. Neither are you, Mr. Thornfield. They looked at each other across the small kitchen table, two people who'd been rejected by the world and were now trying to figure out what to do with each other. So what do we do now? Bertie asked. I suppose we see if we can build something worthwhile out of two disappointments. Despite everything, Bertie found herself smiling. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in years. Honesty seems like a good place to start. That night, as Bertie settled into her small room under the eaves, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. She'd come to Montana expecting to marry a man who would tolerate her in exchange for domestic services. Instead, she'd found someone who seemed to understand exactly what it felt like to be an outsider. Through the thin walls, she could hear Magnus moving around downstairs, banking the fire and checking the locks. The sounds were comforting rather than threatening the routine of someone who cared about safety and security rather than control. For the first time in years, Bertie fell asleep without checking the locks on her door or planning escape routes. Whatever dangers might come, she didn't think they would come from the gentle giant who'd offered her shelter. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Bertie woke to the sound of Magnus moving around below and dressed quickly in her plainest dress, a brown cotton that was practical for ranch work. In the kitchen, she found Magnus drinking coffee and staring out the window at his animals. In the daylight, she could see the full scope of his operation: cattle horses, a small flock of chickens, and a vegetable garden that showed signs of careful tending. Good morning, she said softly. Magnus turned, and Bertie noticed he looked like he'd slept about as well as she had, which was surprisingly well considering the circumstances. Morning, coffee's on the stove. Bertie poured herself a cup and joined him at the window. What needs doing today? Magnus looked at her with surprise. You don't need to worry about ranch work. Mr. Thornfield, I told you yesterday I'm here to be your partner. That means helping with whatever needs doing. The work is hard, physical. Bertie rolled up her sleeves, revealing arms that were soft but strong from years of hard labor. I worked in a textile mill in Boston for 2 years before coming west. I'm not afraid of hard work. Magnus studied her face, looking for signs of false bravado or feminine delicacy. When he found neither, his expression shifted to something that might have been approval. All right then, we'll start with the garden. The vegetables need harvesting, and there's preserving to be done if we want to eat well this winter. They worked together in companionable silence, Bertie picking beans and tomatoes, while Magnus repaired the garden's fence. As the morning progressed, she found herself stealing glances at her new husband. His movements were economical and precise, and despite his size, he was surprisingly graceful. When he removed his hat to wipe his brow, she could see that his hair was thick and brown, shot through with early gray that spoke of a hard life. Around midday, a rider approached from the direction of town. Magnus straightened, and Bertie could see tension creep into his posture. "That's Pastor Williams," he said. "Probably come to check on you." Pastor David Williams was a thin, earnest man in his 40s with kind eyes and the slightly harried look of someone dealing with more problems than he could solve. He dismounted near the garden and tipped his hat to both of them. "Magnus," he said warmly. "Mrs. Thornfield." He smiled at Bertie. "Welcome to Iron Ridge. I hope you're settling in well." "Thank you, Pastor. Very well indeed." "I don't suppose you have any medical knowledge?" Pastor Williams asked hopefully. "We're always in need of someone to help with the women's ailments in childcare. Our nearest doctor is in Helena, 2 days' ride." The question made Bertie's pulse quicken. In Ireland, she'd learned herb lore from her grandmother before the old woman died. Later, she'd expanded that knowledge out of necessity, learning to treat her own injuries when Sean's temper got the better of him. "I know something of herbs and healing," she said carefully. "Nothing formal, just what my grandmother taught me. Any knowledge would be a blessing. My daughter Emma has been having trouble with her eyes. The light hurts them terribly, and she can barely see anymore. The doctor in Helena says there's nothing to be done, but—" Pastor Williams trailed off, but Bertie could hear the desperate hope in his voice. She knew that kind of desperation, the feeling of watching someone you love suffer while being powerless to help. "I could look at her," Bertie offered. "I can't promise anything, but sometimes fresh eyes see things others miss." "Would you? That would be such a blessing." Magnus had remained quiet during this exchange, but Bertie could feel his attention on her. When Pastor Williams rode away with plans to bring Emma the next day, Magnus turned to her with curiosity in his eyes. "You know about doctoring?" "A little, enough to help with basic ailments." Bertie tried to keep her voice casual. "In Ireland, women often had to learn such things. Doctors were expensive and not always available." Magnus nodded, but Bertie could see him filing the information away. She would have to be careful not to reveal too much about her knowledge or how she'd acquired it. That afternoon, as they worked on preserving vegetables for winter, Magnus began to open up about his life. He spoke of growing up as the youngest of 7 children, of reaching his full height by age 16, of the fear and revulsion in people's eyes when they looked at him. "My own mother couldn't bear to look at me toward the end," he said quietly, his hands gentle on the tomatoes he was slicing. "Said I was God's punishment for some sin she'd committed." Bertie's heart ached for the pain in his voice. "What about your father?" "He tried to find work for me. But who wants to hire someone who frightens customers just by walking into a room?" And I ended up in traveling shows for a while, billed as the Montana Giant. Also stood on stages while people paid money to stare at me and call me a freak. That must have been terrible." Magnus shrugged, but Bertie could see the old wounds beneath his resignation. "It was honest work, and it saved me enough money to buy this place, start over somewhere people don't know my history." "Is that working for you, starting over?" Magnus was quiet for a long moment. "It was, until I got lonely enough to send for a bride and realized I was still hoping for something I'll probably never have." "What's that?" "Someone who looks at me and sees a man instead of a curiosity." Bertie stopped her work and turned to face him fully. "I see a man, Magnus Thornfield." The use of his first name seemed to surprise him. He looked at her with something that might have been hope struggling against years of disappointment. "Do you?" "I see a man who's gentle with his horses, who builds furniture with his own hands, who tends a garden because he knows the value of growing things. I see someone who's been hurt but hasn't let it make him cruel." Magnus's eyes were bright with emotion he was trying to control. "What about when you look in a mirror, Bridget O'Connor? What do you see?" The question caught her off guard. Bertie looked down at her hands, soft and plump, despite their strength. "I see someone who takes up too much space," she admitted. "Someone who's never quite fit where she was supposed to." "You fit here." The words were simple, but they hit Bertie with the force of revelation. She looked up to find Magnus watching her with an expression she'd never seen directed at her before. Not pity, not resignation, but something that looked almost like wonder. "Do I tell?" You fit here, Magnus repeated firmly. In this kitchen, in this life. You fit here, Birdie. The nickname sounded natural in his deep voice, and for the first time since arriving in Montana, Birdie allowed herself to hope that she might have found not just a hiding place but a home. That hope was tested the next morning when Pastor Williams arrived with his daughter Emma. The 10-year-old girl clung to her father's hand, her face pale and drawn with pain. Even in the dim light of the kitchen, Birdie could see that Emma's eyes were red and watering, the pupils unnaturally dilated. The light hurts her something terrible, Pastor Williams explained, and her vision gets worse every day. The doctor said it might be some kind of infection, but his medicines haven't helped. Birdie knelt down to Emma's level, speaking softly. Hello, sweetheart. Your papa tells me your eyes are bothering you. May I take a look? Emma nodded hesitantly, and Birdie gently examined the child's eyes. What she saw made her heart sink. The symptoms looked like inflammation of the optic nerve, something she'd seen before in Ireland, usually caused by malnutrition or infection. But as she looked closer, she noticed something else. Emma's skin had an odd pallor, and there were small dark spots around her hairline that looked almost like... Emma, Birdie said gently, have you been feeling sick in other ways or trouble eating? She's been poorly for months, Pastor Williams said. Ever since her mother died last spring. I thought it was just grief, but... Birdie's mind raced. The symptoms taken together suggested something that most frontier doctors wouldn't even think to look for, something that required a very specific treatment. Pastor Williams, she said carefully, I think Emma's problems might be related to what she's eating, or rather, what she's not eating. Has she had fresh vegetables? Fruit. We've been living mostly on salt pork and cornmeal since Martha died. I'm not much of a cook, and Emma hasn't had much appetite. Birdie felt a surge of hope. If she was right, Emma's condition was treatable, but it would mean revealing more of her medical knowledge than she'd intended. I think Emma has scurvy, she said quietly. Pastor Williams looked blank. Scurvy. But that's a sailor's disease. It can affect anyone who doesn't get enough fresh food. The eye problems, the fatigue, even these small spots on her skin, they're all signs. But it's treatable if we act quickly. Magnus had been standing quietly in the corner, but now he stepped forward. What does she need, Chum? Fresh fruits and vegetables, especially anything with what the doctors call anti-scorbutic properties. Rose hips are particularly good, and I saw some growing wild near the creek. With proper nutrition and some herbal treatments for her eyes, she should recover completely. Pastor Williams's face lit up with hope for the first time since entering the house. You really think she can be cured? I do, but it will take time and careful attention to her diet. Anything, I'll do anything to help her. Birdie spent the next hour preparing a treatment plan for Emma, mixing rosehip tea and showing Pastor Williams how to prepare nourishing foods. As she worked, she was acutely aware of Magnus, watching her every move, seeing how naturally medical knowledge came to her. After Pastor Williams left with his daughter and a basket of supplies, Magnus turned to Birdie with questions in his eyes. That was impressive, he said quietly. Just common sense. Anyone who'd seen scurvy before would have recognized the signs. Where exactly did you see scurvy before, Birdie? The question was gently asked, but Birdie heard the underlying suspicion. She'd revealed too much shown knowledge that went beyond what a poor Irish immigrant should possess. On the ships coming from Ireland, she said carefully, many people got sick during the crossing. It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. She had seen scurvy on the immigrant ships, but her real knowledge came from years of studying medical texts and secret learning. Everything she could about healing, because doctors were expensive and Sean wouldn't pay for them anyway. Magnus nodded slowly, but Birdie could see he wasn't entirely satisfied with her explanation. She would have to be more careful in the future about revealing the full extent of her abilities. But as they went about their daily chores, Birdie found herself thinking about Emma Williams's pale face and the hope in her father's eyes. Whatever the risk to herself, she couldn't ignore suffering when she had the power to help. That decision would soon be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. 2 weeks passed in what Birdie had begun to think of as the calm before the storm. She and Magnus settled into a routine that was surprisingly comfortable, working together in the garden, sharing quiet meals, slowly learning each other's habits and preferences. Emma Williams had begun to recover dramatically. The rosehip tea and careful nutrition were working exactly as Birdie had hoped, and the little girl's eyes were becoming brighter each day. Pastor Williams stopped by frequently with updates and gratitude, that made Bertie's heart both sore and ache with worry. Word was spreading through Iron Ridge about the miracle cure, and other people had begun appearing at the ranch asking for help with various ailments. Bertie found herself treating everything from infected cuts to difficult pregnancies, always careful to downplay her knowledge and attribute her success to Irish folk remedies. But her growing reputation was attracting unwanted attention. Magnus had grown increasingly protective as more visitors appeared at their door. He never questioned her right to help people, but Bertie could see the concern in his eyes when she worked late into the night preparing medicines, or when strangers lingered too long asking questions about her background. The crisis came on a warm August morning when a rider approached the ranch at full gallop. Bertie was hanging laundry behind the house when she heard the hoofbeats, and something about the urgency of the approach made her freeze with recognition and terror. She knew that riding style, that particular way of controlling a horse with rough hands and little regard for the animal's comfort. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the rider before she could see his face. Sean O'Connor sat his horse near the front porch, looking exactly as she remembered, red-faced, thick-bodied, with the cruel eyes of a man who enjoyed causing pain. He was dressed in traveling clothes that suggested he'd come a long way, and the satisfied smile on his face told her everything she needed to know. He'd found her. Through the house, she could hear Magnus's voice, carefully polite but wary. "Can I help you with something?" "Looking for my wife," Sean said, his Irish accent thick with false charm. "Been told she might be in these parts. Bridget O'Connor, her name was, before she took yours." Bertie's hands shook so hard she could barely hold the sheet she'd been hanging. She needed to run, needed to get away before Sean saw her, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground. "Mrs. Thornfield is my wife," Magnus said firmly. "Has been for nearly a month now." Sean's laugh was ugly. "Is that what she told you? Well, let me tell you the truth about your Mrs. Thornfield. The woman's a liar and a thief, and she's still legally married to me." "That's impossible. She's a widow." "Widow?" Sean's voice rose with amusement. "Did she tell you I was dead? Well, as you can see, I'm very much alive, and I've come to collect what's mine." Bertie heard Magnus's sharp intake of breath and knew the moment he began to understand the full scope of her deception. She told him Sean was dead, had built their entire relationship on that lie. Now the truth was standing on his front porch, demanding her return. "Even if what you're saying is true," Magnus said carefully, "Mrs. Thornfield is under my protection now." "Protection?" Sean's laugh was harsh. "From what? From her lawful husband. I have every right to take her back to Ireland, where she belongs. I have a right to hear her side of this." "Oh, you'll hear it all right. But first, why don't you ask her about the money she stole when she ran away, or about the papers she forged to make it look like I was dead?" Bertie closed her eyes, knowing that every word was destroying whatever chance she might have had of explaining herself to Magnus. Sean had always been clever with the truth, twisting it just enough to serve his purposes. She heard footsteps around the side of the house and knew Magnus was coming to find her. When he appeared, his face was pale with shock and something that might have been betrayal. "Bertie," his voice was quiet, controlled, "there's someone here who says he's your husband." She met his eyes and saw the exact moment he registered her terror. Magnus might be shocked by Sean's revelations, but he could see her fear clearly enough. "He is my husband," she said quietly. "Legally. But Magnus, you don't understand." "I understand enough." Sean's voice cut across the yard as he walked around the house to join them. When he saw Bertie, his smile became predatory. "Hello, darling wife. You've led me quite a chase." Bertie shrank back instinctively, and Magnus immediately stepped between her and Sean. Despite his own shock and confusion, his protective instincts were stronger than his hurt. "You're frightening her," Magnus said quietly. "Am I?" Sean looked amused. "Well, she's always been the nervous type, especially when she's been caught doing something she shouldn't." "What do you want?" Bertie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do I want? I want my wife back, of course. I want the money you stole from our savings. And I want compensation from your new husband here for harboring a criminal." Magnus turned to look at Bertie, and she could see him struggling to reconcile the woman he'd come to know with the picture Sean was painting. "Is it true about the money?" he asked gently. Bertie's throat felt like sandpaper. "I took 50 pounds. It was money I'd saved from my work at the mill, but Sean considered it his because wives can't own property." "She stole it," Sean corrected, "just like she stole those forged death papers." Do you know how much trouble she could be in for that? How much trouble you could be in for marrying a woman who's already got a husband? Magnus's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. What exactly are you proposing? Simple. She comes back to Ireland with me, you keep quiet about the bigamy, and everyone walks away from this mess without involving the law. And if I refuse, Sean's smile turned ugly, then I go to the territorial marshal with evidence that you knowingly married another man's wife. Bigamy's a serious crime out here, isn't it? Could cost you this ranch, maybe even get you prison time. Bertie watched Magnus process this threat, saw him weighing his options. She knew what Sean was offering, a clean exit from a mess that could destroy everything Magnus had worked for. All he had to do was hand her over to a man who'd made her life hell for 3 years. I need to think about this, Magnus said finally. Don't think too long, Sean warned. I'm staying at the hotel in town, but my patience isn't unlimited. You have until tomorrow to decide. After Sean rode away, Magnus and Bertie stood in the yard in tense silence. She could feel the weight of his shock and disappointment, could see him struggling to understand how the woman he'd begun to trust could have deceived him so completely. You lied to me, he said finally. Yes. About everything. Bertie considered the question carefully. About Sean being dead, yes. About why I came west partially, but not about who I am now, not about what I feel for you. Magnus turned to face her, and she saw pain in his eyes that cut her deeper than any of Sean's blows ever had. How can I know what's real and what isn't? How can I trust anything you've told me? Because you know me, Bertie said desperately. You've seen who I am these past weeks. That's not a lie, Magnus. That's the real me. The real you is legally married to another man. The words hit like a slap. Bertie nodded, accepting the truth of it, even as it broke her heart. Yes, but Magnus, if you knew what kind of marriage it was, tell me. The command was quiet but firm. Magnus deserved the truth, all of it, no matter how ugly or shameful. Bertie sat down heavily on the porch steps, gathering her courage. Sean O'Connor was my father's choice, not mine. I was 17 when they arranged the marriage, and I thought I was lucky because Sean had money and prospects. Magnus sat beside her, not close enough to touch, but close enough to listen. The problem started on our wedding night. Bertie continued, her voice barely audible. Sean had very specific ideas about what a wife should be: silent, obedient, invisible, unless he needed something. When I didn't meet those expectations, she rolled up her sleeve, showing Magnus a faint scar that ran along her forearm. This was from a broken bottle. He said I was too fat, that I embarrassed him in front of his friends. Said no one would believe him if I tried to tell anyone, because who would choose me over him? Magnus's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained gentle. How long did this go on? 3 years. I tried to leave twice, but he always found me. Said I belonged to him, that marriage was a lifetime contract, and he'd make sure I honored it. What about the law? The church. Bertie's laugh was bitter. Wife beating isn't illegal in Ireland, Magnus. The church says marriage is sacred, that a wife's duty is to submit to her husband in all things. I had nowhere to go and no way to support myself. So you decided to fake his death. I saved every penny I could for 2 years. When I heard about the mine accident, I paid a forger to add Sean's name to the list of the dead. Then I took the money I'd hidden and ran. Magnus was quiet for a long time, staring out at the mountains. Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? Because I was afraid you wouldn't want a wife who was still legally married to someone else. And because I was afraid he'd find me if anyone knew the truth. But he found you anyway. Yes, Bertie's voice broke on the word, and now I've dragged you into my mess. Sean's right about the legal problems you could face for marrying me. Magnus turned to look at her, and Bertie was surprised to see not condemnation in his eyes, but something that looked like resolve. Do you want to go back to him? I'd rather die first. Then you won't. The simple declaration made Bertie's heart stop. Magnus, you don't understand what you're risking. Sean isn't bluffing about the law. Bigamy really is a serious crime, and you could lose everything. I could lose everything if I let him take you too. Before Bertie could ask what he meant by that, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both tense. But this time it was Pastor Williams riding hard with his daughter Emma in front of him. Magnus, Bertie, thank God you're here, he called as he dismounted. We need help. There's been an accident at the mill, several men trapped and hurt badly. The nearest doctor is days away and he looked at Bertie with desperate hope. I know you're not a real doctor, but you've done more for Emma than any trained physician. Will you come? People are dying. Bertie looked at Magnus, torn between the need to help and the danger of exposing herself further. If she went to town, Sean would see her. He might cause trouble, might hurt people to get to her. Go, Magnus said quietly. I'll handle Sean. Magnus, those people need you, Bertie. That's who you are, someone who helps when others are suffering. Don't let him take that away from you. The trust in his voice nearly brought tears to her eyes. Despite everything, despite her lies and the danger she'd brought to his door, Magnus still believed in who she was at her core. All right, she said, already mentally cataloging the supplies she'd need. But Magnus promised me you won't do anything dangerous. Sean is cleverer than he looks, and he's capable of real violence. Magnus's expression darkened. So am I when someone threatens what's mine. The mill accident was worse than Pastor Williams had described. A steam pipe had burst, scalding several workers and trapping others under collapsed timber. By the time Bertie arrived with her medical supplies, 3 men were already near death from their injuries. She worked for hours in the makeshift hospital they'd set up in the church, treating burns with honey and herbs, setting broken bones, and fighting to save lives with knowledge that went far beyond what any Irish peasant should possess. The townspeople watched her work with a mixture of awe and growing suspicion. Where did you learn to do that? Asked Dr. Morrison, a traveling physician who'd arrived from Helena too late to help much. Folk medicine, Bertie replied, not looking up from the burn she was treating. Irish women learn these things out of necessity. But even as she said it, she could see doubt in the doctor's eyes. Her techniques were too precise, her knowledge too comprehensive. She was drawing attention to herself at the worst possible time. The situation became critical when she was called to treat the mill foreman, a man named Tom Bradley, who'd been trapped under burning timber for nearly an hour. His burns were extensive, and Dr. Morrison had already given him up for dead. But Bertie could see that while the burns were severe, they hadn't penetrated deep enough to cause fatal damage. With the right treatment, he could survive, but it would require techniques that would expose the full extent of her medical knowledge. She looked around at Tom's wife and children, at the other workers watching hopefully, and made her decision. Whatever the consequences, she couldn't let a man die when she had the skill to save him. Working quickly, she cleaned the burns with a solution of herbs and honey, then applied a complicated dressing that would protect the wounds while allowing them to heal. She mixed pain medication from plants she'd gathered in the mountains and stayed by Tom's side through the night, monitoring his condition and adjusting his treatment as needed. By morning, it was clear that Tom Bradley would live. The townspeople were calling it a miracle, but Dr. Morrison was asking pointed questions about where exactly Bertie had learned such advanced techniques. I've never seen anything like what you did last night, he said quietly. That was surgeon-level work. Are you sure you're not a trained physician? Before Bertie could answer, a commotion outside the church made everyone turn. Sean O'Connor was standing in the doorway, his face red with anger. There you are, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. I've been looking everywhere for my wife. The word wife sent a shock through the assembled townspeople. Bertie saw Pastor Williams's face pale as he realized the implications. Your wife, Dr. Morrison asked, but Mrs. Thornfield is married to Magnus Thornfield. Sean's smile was triumphant. Did anyone actually verify that she was free to marry? Because I have our marriage certificate right here, dated 3 years ago in County Cork. He pulled out a folded document and handed it to Dr. Morrison, who examined it with growing concern. This appears to be legitimate, the doctor said slowly. Mrs. O'Connor, can you explain this? All eyes turned to Bertie, and she felt the weight of their stares like physical blows. These people had trusted her, had let her treat their loved ones, and now they were learning that everything about her was a lie. It's complicated, she said quietly. Complicated. Sean laughed. What's complicated about it? She's my wife, she ran away from home, and she's been living in sin with another man while pretending to be something she's not. That's not the whole story, Pastor Williams said firmly. Bertie has done nothing but good since coming to Iron Ridge. She saved Emma's eyesight, and she just saved Tom Bradley's life. Oh, I'm sure she has, Sean said smoothly. She's always been clever with her little herb remedies. Too clever, some might say. Tell me, doctor, doesn't it strike you as odd that an Irish peasant woman would have such advanced medical knowledge? Dr. Morrison looked troubled. It is unusual. Unusual enough to make you wonder where she really learned it. Because I can tell you she spent months working as assistant to a doctor in Cork before she married me. Dr. William Hendricks, his name was, taught her everything he knew before she decided his wife was getting suspicious about how much time they were spending together. The implication hit the room like a thunderbolt. Sean was suggesting that Oye Bertie had been having an affair with a married doctor, that her medical knowledge came from an illicit relationship. That's not true, Bertie said desperately, but she could see doubt spreading across the faces around her. Isn't it? Sean pulled out another document. Dr. Hendricks was found dead in his office 6 months after you disappeared. Poison, they said. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? The accusation was monstrous, but Sean delivered it with such casual confidence that several people stepped back from Bertie in alarm. You're lying, she whispered. Am I? Then why don't we send a telegram to Cork and ask about Dr. Hendricks? I'm sure they'd be very interested to know where his former assistant ended up. Bertie felt the walls closing in around her. Sean had twisted just enough truth to make his lies believable. She had worked with Dr. Hendricks, but as a desperate woman trying to learn enough to treat her own injuries. And while she didn't know what had happened to the doctor after she left Ireland, she was sure Sean had somehow turned it to his advantage. I think, Dr. Morrison said slowly, that we should notify the territorial marshal about this situation. If there are questions about about this woman's past, they need to be investigated properly. Excellent idea, Sean agreed. I'm sure the marshal will be very interested in hearing about bigamy, medical fraud, and possible murder. Before anyone could respond, the church door burst open and Magnus Thornfield filled the doorway. At 6 to 9, he had to duck to enter, and his presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Bertie, he said quietly, it's time to go home. Sean stepped forward, confident in his position. Actually, she'll be coming with me. She's my wife, and I have the law on my side. Magnus looked at Sean with an expression that would have frightened a wiser man. The only law I recognize is the one that says a man protects what's his. And she's mine now. You can't just take her, Dr. Morrison protested. If what this man says is true, there are serious legal questions. Then let the law sort them out, Magnus said calmly. But while they're doing that, my wife stays with me. He moved toward Bertie and several people stepped aside instinctively. Whatever gentle, giant reputation Magnus might have had in that moment, he looked fully capable of violence. Bertie, he said softly, extending his hand, come home with me. She looked into his eyes and saw not doubt or condemnation, but absolute resolve. He was offering to stand with her against whatever came to fight for her, even though she'd lied to him. Magnus, she whispered, if you do this, there's no going back. Sean will make sure you lose everything. Then we'll lose it together. Bertie took his offered hand and let him lead her from the church. Behind them, she could hear Sean's voice rising in anger and Dr. Morrison calling for someone to fetch the marshal. But for the first time since Sean had appeared, Bertie felt something other than despair. She felt hope. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The ride back to the ranch was tense and silent. Magnus drove the wagon with controlled fury, his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Bertie sat beside him, acutely aware of the storm they were racing toward. Behind them, Iron Ridge was probably buzzing with gossip about the bigamous bride and her giant protector. By evening, the territorial marshal would likely be on his way, and with him would come questions that could destroy everything Magnus had built. I'm sorry, Bertie said quietly as they pulled into the ranch yard. Magnus helped her down from the wagon, his touch gentle despite the tension radiating from his massive frame. For which part? All of it. Lying to you, bringing this trouble to your door, dragging you into a mess that could cost you everything. Magnus was quiet for a moment, unhitching the horses with practiced efficiency. Are you sorry for saving Tom Bradley's life? For curing Emma Williams? For helping all those people who came to our door looking for healing? No, but then don't apologize for who you are, Bertie. Apologize for the lies if you need to, but not for the good you've done. His words brought tears to her eyes, but before she could respond, the sound of multiple horses approaching made them both tense. Through the gathering dusk, they could see 5 riders heading toward the ranch at a steady pace. That'll be the marshal, Magnus said grimly. Probably brought a posse with him. Bertie's heart hammered against her ribs. Magnus, you could still turn me over to them. Tell them I deceived you, that you had no idea about the bigamy. Sean would have to accept that. Magnus looked down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Is that what you want me to do? I want you to be safe. I want you to keep your ranch and your life and not pay for my mistakes. That's not what I asked. Magnus stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. Do you want me to turn you over to them? Bertie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of absolute honesty settling around her like a shroud. No, I want to stay here with you. I want to be your wife in truth, not just on paper. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're downstairs making coffee, and I want to fall asleep every night feeling safe because you're in the house. When she opened her eyes, Magnus was smiling, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since Sean's arrival. Then that's what we'll fight for. The riders pulled up in the ranch yard just as Magnus and Bertie reached the front porch. The territorial marshal, a weathered man in his 50s named Jake Carson, dismounted with the careful movements of someone who'd spent too many years in the saddle. Magnus Thornfield, he called. That's me. I'm Marshal Carson. I believe you know why I'm here. Magnus nodded toward the porch. Suppose you'd better come in and say your piece. In the parlor, Marshal Carson settled his considerable bulk into one of Magnus's oversized chairs, while his deputies remained outside. Sean O'Connor was conspicuously absent, probably waiting in town for the marshal to do his dirty work. Mr. Thornfield, Marshal Carson began, I'm going to be straight with you. I've got a complaint alleging that you knowingly married a woman who was already legally wed to another man. That's bigamy, which is a serious crime in this territory. And I suppose Mr. O'Connor has evidence to support this claim. He does. Marriage certificate from Ireland dated 3 years back. Seems legitimate enough. Magnus leaned back in his chair, surprisingly calm for a man facing potential prison time. What does Mrs. Thornfield say about all this? Well, that's just it. Legally speaking, there is no Mrs. Thornfield. If O'Connor's documents are genuine, then your marriage ceremony was invalid. Bertie felt her heart crack a little at the words. She'd known it was true, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly made it feel real in a way that was almost unbearable. Marshal, she said quietly, may I ask what exactly Mr. O'Connor is requesting? He wants you returned to him as his lawful wife. Says he's willing to overlook the bigamy charges if Mr. Thornfield cooperates voluntarily. And if he doesn't cooperate, Marshal Carson looked uncomfortable. Then I'll have to arrest both of you. You for bigamy, him for harboring a criminal. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Bertie could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on them, the knowledge that whatever they chose would change everything. Marshal Magnus said finally, what would it take to prove that Mrs. O'Connor here had legitimate reasons for leaving her husband, that she was forced to take drastic action to protect herself? You'd need evidence. Witnesses to abuse medical records, something that would justify her actions in a court of law. Bertie's heart sank. She had no such evidence. The doctor who treated her broken ribs had been discreet, and the neighbors who might have heard her screams had always been careful to look the other way. What if, Magnus continued thoughtfully, what if we could prove that Sean O'Connor had committed crimes of his own, that he wasn't the innocent husband he claims to be? Marshal Carson raised an eyebrow. What kind of crimes? Before Magnus could answer, a commotion outside made everyone freeze. Shouts, the sound of horses moving fast, and then gunshots echoing across the ranch yard. Magnus was on his feet, immediately moving toward the window with surprising speed for such a large man. Riders coming in fast. Looks like trouble. Through the window, Bertie could see men on horseback surrounding the house, their faces hidden by bandanas. The Dalton gang, she recognized their leader's distinctive black hat and silver-studded saddle. Marshal, Magnus said grimly, looks like we've got bigger problems than bigamy charges. Carson was already moving toward his gun, his face grim. Jake Dalton's boys, been hitting ranches all through the territory. How many? Bertie asked, surprising herself with how calm her voice sounded. 6, maybe 7. Magnus replied, checking his rifle with practiced efficiency. They've got us outnumbered, but we've got better cover. The next few hours would test everything they'd built together, everything they'd learned to trust about each other. But as Bertie watched Magnus prepare to defend their home, she realized that whatever legal complications they faced paled in comparison to the immediate threat outside their door. What do you need me to do? She asked. Magnus looked at her with something that might have been pride. Can you shoot? Well enough. Then grab that shotgun from the closet and cover the back of the house. They'll try to flank us once the shooting starts. As Bertie moved to follow his instructions, Marshal Carson caught her arm. Mrs. Whatever your name is, when this is over, we still need to settle the matter of your legal status. Bertie met his eyes steadily. Marshal, if we survive this, I'll answer any questions you have. But right now, those men outside don't care whether my marriage is legal or not. They just want to rob and kill anyone who gets in their way. Fair enough. Carson checked his own weapon and moved toward the front window. But don't think this conversation is over. The first shot shattered the parlor window, sending glass flying across the room. Magnus returned fire immediately, his rifle booming in the confined space. From her position at the back window, Bertie could see two riders circling toward the kitchen, just as Magnus had predicted. She'd never shot at human beings before, but as one of the riders raised his pistol toward the house, Bertie's finger tightened on the trigger. The shotgun's recoil nearly knocked her backward, but her aim was true enough to send the rider tumbling from his saddle. Good shot, Magnus called from the front room. The battle was intense but brief. The Dalton gang was used to easy targets, isolated ranchers with no help coming. They weren't prepared for a giant who could shoot like a marksman, a marshal with military experience, and a woman who didn't panic under fire. When the smoke cleared, 3 outlaws were dead, and the rest were fleeing toward the mountains. Magnus had taken a bullet through his left shoulder, but he was still standing. Marshal Carson had a graze across his cheek that made him look more dangerous than hurt. Bertie emerged from the kitchen with her medical supplies, moving immediately to treat Magnus's wound. As she worked cutting away his shirt and cleaning the bullet graze, she was aware of Carson watching her with professional interest. You handle yourself well under pressure, the marshal observed. I've had practice dealing with dangerous men, Bertie replied, not looking up from Magnus's wound. The bullet went clean through, she continued, addressing Magnus. You'll be sore for a few weeks, but there shouldn't be any permanent damage. As she bandaged his shoulder with practiced efficiency, Magnus caught her hand. Thank you. For what? For staying, for fighting with me instead of running when the shooting started. Bertie looked into his eyes and saw something that made her breath catch. Not just gratitude, but something deeper. Something that looked remarkably like love. Where would I run to? She asked softly. This is home now. Marshal Carson cleared his throat, reminding them both of his presence. That was good work, both of you. But we still have the matter of your legal situation to resolve. Before either of them could respond, the sound of a single horse approaching at a gallop made Carson reach for his gun again. But this rider was alone, and as he came into view, Bertie recognized Pastor Williams. Marshal Carson, the pastor called as he dismounted. Thank God you're all right. We heard the shooting from town. We're fine, Pastor. Dalton's gang won't be bothering anyone else for a while. Pastor Williams looked around at the evidence of the battle-broken windows, bullet holes in the walls, bodies in the yard, and shook his head grimly. There's something else, he said. Something you need to know about Sean O'Connor. Bertie's heart stopped. What about him? Dr. Morrison got curious about his story, so he sent a telegram to Cork asking about Dr. Hendricks. The reply just came back. Pastor Williams pulled out a telegram and handed it to Marshal Carson. Dr. Hendricks is alive and well, never was poisoned, never even knew anyone named Bridget O'Connor. The whole story was a lie. Carson read the telegram, his eyebrows rising. Says here that Sean O'Connor is wanted by the Irish authorities for fraud and assault. Been using fake documents to extort money from people. Bertie felt her knees go weak with relief. He made it all up. Every word Pastor Williams confirmed. Doctor, Morrison started asking around town, and it turns out O'Connor's been telling different stories to different people. Told the hotel clerk you'd stolen money from a church, told the bartender you were running from the law for murder. Marshal Carson looked thoughtful. Sounds like a confidence man to me. Someone who makes his living by finding marks and exploiting their weaknesses. But what about the marriage certificate? Bertie asked. Could be another forgery. We won't know for sure until we can verify it with the church records in Ireland. But given what we now know about O'Connor's character, Magnus stood up carefully, favoring his wounded shoulder. Where is O'Connor now? That's the thing, Pastor Williams said. He's disappeared, checked out of the hotel this morning and said he was riding to Helena on business. But the stable owner saw him heading south instead toward the territorial border. Running, Carson said with satisfaction. Classic behavior for a con man when his marks start asking too many questions. Bertie sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune. After months of living in fear, terrified that Sean would find her and drag her back to a life of abuse, she was discovering that he might never have had any legal claim to her at all. Marshal, Magnus said quietly, "What does this mean for our situation?" "Well, if O'Connor's marriage certificate is fraudulent, then there's no bigamy to prosecute. Your marriage to Mrs. O'Connor would be perfectly legal. And if the certificate is genuine," Carson considered this carefully, "even if the marriage was legitimate, originally a man who commits fraud and flees the territory before completing his complaint, well, that doesn't look good for his credibility. I'd say the chances of any prosecutor wanting to pursue bigamy charges under these circumstances are pretty slim." Relief flooded through Bertie like a physical sensation. She looked at Magnus and saw the same relief in his eyes, it mixed with something that made her pulse quicken. "So we're really married?" she asked. "Looks that way," Carson replied. "Of course, you might want to have another ceremony just to be certain. Make sure all the paperwork is in order." Pastor Williams smiled. "I'd be happy to perform the service anytime you'd like." As the marshal and pastor prepared to leave, organizing the removal of the bodies and the filing of reports about the battle with the Dalton gang, Magnus and Bertie found themselves alone on the porch. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. In the distance, cattle were moving toward water, and somewhere a meadowlark was singing its liquid notes into the gathering dusk. "So," Magnus said softly, "it appears we're married after all." "Appears so." Bertie looked up at him, noting the way the evening light softened his harsh features. "Are you disappointed?" "Disappointed?" Magnus's laugh was warm and genuine. "Bertie, I thought I was going to lose you today. First to your past, then to bullets. I can't think of anything that would make me happier than the chance to spend the rest of my life with you. Even though I lied to you, even though I brought all this trouble to your door." Magnus reached out to cup her face gently in his massive hands. "You lied because you were afraid. You brought trouble because evil men followed you here. But you also brought healing to this community, love to this house, and hope to a man who'd given up on both. Magnus, I love you, Bertie O'Connor Thornfield. I love your courage and your kindness and your stubborn refusal to let suffering go untreated when you have the power to heal it. I love the way you hum while you cook and the way you talk to the horses like they're old friends." Our tears were running down Bertie's cheeks, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy, rather than pain. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love your gentle hands and your generous heart and the way you make me feel safe just by being in the room. I love that you saw past my lies to who I really was and that you chose to fight for me even when it would have been easier to let me go." Magnus leaned down to kiss her, and Bertie rose on her toes to meet him halfway. It was their first real kiss, born of love rather than obligation, and it tasted like promise and possibility and home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Magnus rested his forehead against hers. "So what happens now?" Bertie asked. "Now we have that second wedding ceremony Pastor Williams mentioned. We invite the whole town, make sure everyone knows you're my wife and under my protection. And then," Magnus smiled, and Bertie saw her entire future reflected in his eyes. "Then we live, Bertie. We work this ranch together. We help people who need healing. We build the life we both thought we'd never have. We love each other and let that love overflow to everyone around us. What about people who still have questions about my past, about where I learned my medical knowledge? Let them wonder. Iron Ridge needs a healer, and you're the best they're likely to get. People will accept what they need to accept." As if summoned by their conversation, a small group of riders approached from town. But these weren't lawmen or outlaws, they were neighbors. Tom Bradley still bandaged, but insisting on riding out to check on them. The Morrison family bringing food and offers to help repair the damage from the battle. Emma Williams, her eyes bright and clear, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers for the woman who'd given her back her sight. "Looks like the community's already made its decision about us," Magnus observed. Bertie watched the familiar faces approaching and felt something she'd never experienced before, the sense of truly belonging somewhere. These people knew her story, now knew about the laws and the complications and the danger she'd brought. And they were coming anyway, offering support and friendship and acceptance. "Mrs. Thornfield," Emma called as she ran up the porch steps. "Are you hurt? Papa said there was fighting." "I'm fine, sweetheart." Bertie replied, accepting the flowers with a smile. Mr. Thornfield and the marshal took very good care of me. Good, I was worried about you. Mama says you and Mr. Thornfield are heroes for fighting off those bad men. Over Emma's head, Bertie met Magnus's eyes and saw her own amazement reflected there. Heroes, not criminals or freaks or outcasts, but heroes. As the evening progressed, the house filled with neighbors helping to clean up and repair the damage. Stories were told and retold, growing more dramatic with each telling. Tom Bradley insisted on shaking Magnus's hand repeatedly, thanking him for the courage to stand up to the Dalton gang. Dr. Morrison quietly asked Bertie if she'd be willing to work with him on difficult cases, admitting that her knowledge far exceeded his own. "Where did you really learn medicine?" he asked during a quiet moment. Bertie considered her answer carefully. "From necessity, Dr. Morrison. When you're hurt and can't afford proper medical care, you learn to heal yourself. When people around you are suffering and there's no doctor for miles, you learn to help however you can." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough. And Dr. Morrison seemed to understand the parts she wasn't saying. "Well, however you learned it, this community is lucky to have you. I hope you'll consider making your skills official. There's always a need for qualified medical help on the frontier." The idea was intriguing, but Bertie wasn't ready to think that far ahead. For now, it was enough to be accepted, to be safe, to be loved. As the last neighbors departed and she and Magnus finally had their home to themselves, they sat together on the porch swing he'd built during their first week of marriage. His arm was around her shoulders, careful of his wound, and her head rested against his chest. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. Bertie considered the question. She was married to a man who loved her exactly as she was. She lived in a place where her skills were valued and her past didn't define her future. She was safe from Sean O'Connor and free to build whatever life she chose. "I'm happy," she said, surprised by how true it was. "For the first time in my adult life, I'm genuinely happy." "Good, because I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the horses whinnied softly in response. It was the sound of home, of belonging, of a life finally lived without fear. "Magnus," Bertie said softly. When we have that second wedding ceremony, there's something I want to include." "What's that?" "A promise. Not just to love and honor each other, but to see beyond appearances always. To judge people by their hearts rather than their faces or their figures or their histories." Magnus tightened his arm around her. "I like that promise. And I want to invite everyone, all the people in town who've been kind to us, all the patients I've treated, everyone who's looked past surface judgments to see who we really are. Even the ones who called us freaks when we first arrived." Bertie smiled. "Especially them. People can change, Magnus. They can learn to see differently if you give them the chance." "Is that your professional medical opinion, Dr. Thornfield?" The title made her laugh. "Dr. Thornfield. I like the sound of that. Well, then maybe that's what you'll become officially someday. Maybe you'll study medicine properly, get the credentials to match your knowledge." The possibility had never occurred to Bertie before, but as she thought about it, she realized it wasn't entirely impossible. The frontier was changing, and there were opportunities for women who were brave enough to seize them. "Maybe I will," she said, "but for now I'm content to be Mrs. Magnus Thornfield, wife and partner and healer to anyone who needs help." "Mrs. Magnus Thornfield," Magnus repeated as if testing the sound. "My wife, my partner, my heart." "Forever," Bertie promised. "Forever," he agreed. They renewed their vows 3 weeks later in the Iron Ridge Church with the entire town in attendance. Emma Williams scattered rose petals. Tom Bradley stood as Magnus's best man, and Pastor Williams performed the ceremony with tears in his eyes. Dr. Morrison served as Bertie's witness, and in his brief speech at the reception, he announced that Mrs. Thornfield would be working with him officially as a medical assistant, the first step toward whatever future she chose to build. The wedding feast was held in the churchyard, with tables groaning under the weight of food contributed by grateful patients and new friends. There were toasts and laughter and dancing until well past midnight. But the moment Bertie treasured most came during the ceremony itself, when Magnus looked into her eyes and made his promise. "I vow to see you always as you truly are not as the world expects you to be, but as the beautiful, strong, healing woman I've come to love." I promise to stand beside you to protect you, to trust you, and to build with you a life worthy of the love we've found. When it was her turn, Bertie spoke from her heart. I vow to be honest with you, always to trust you with my whole heart, to heal what I can and love what I cannot heal. I promise to see you not as the world sees you, but as the gentle, generous, courageous man who gave me a home when I was lost. As they kissed to seal their promises, the congregation erupted in cheers. These were people who understood the value of second chances, who knew how rare it was to find love in a harsh world. Later, as they drove home under a sky full of stars, Bertie reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd fled Ireland as a broken, terrified woman, with nothing but lies and forged papers. She'd arrived in Montana expecting tolerance, at best resigned to a marriage of convenience. Instead, she'd found love beyond her wildest dreams. She'd found acceptance for exactly who she was. She'd found a place where her gifts were valued and her past didn't matter. Most importantly, she'd found a man who saw her heart before he saw anything else. "What are you thinking about?" Magnus asked as they pulled into their ranch yard. "About how far we've both come," Bertie replied. "6 months ago, we were both alone, both convinced we were unlovable because we didn't fit the world's narrow definitions. And now we know better. We know that love doesn't have a size or a shape or a perfect appearance. We know that the heart sees what the eyes cannot." Magnus helped her down from the wagon and gathered her into his arms, lifting her easily, despite her protests about his shoulder. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thornfield," he said softly. "Welcome home, Mr. Thornfield," she replied. And as he carried her over the threshold of their house, Bertie knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. In the arms of a man who loved her completely, in a home they'd built together, in a community that had learned to see past appearances to the truth beneath. The heart she had discovered was indeed wise enough to see beyond what the world called beautiful. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it led you home to a love that was beautiful in ways that mattered most. Thank you for joining Bertie and Magnus on their journey of love, acceptance, and courage. If you enjoyed this story of finding true love despite the world's judgments, please like and subscribe for more heartwarming Western romance tales that celebrate the beauty of authentic love in all its forms.